Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the course on GVC analysis for BIMSTEC region. Uh, Today is important day because not only you have already done all the self-learning, but also we have uh, distinguished panelists, guest speakers join us today. I guess after you watch 4 modules, which is very deep dive into GVC analysis, both from how GVC is important, how it's going to move, that dynamics, and how you could explore them in more evidence-based and make implications to policy, to answer policy questions. You would have many questions uh, when you do the self-study video. So today is very good opportunities for you to ask questions, bring your doubt, your concerns, and we have both Biswajit and Dr. Nihal, Dr. Prabir to help you clarify those points. First of all, I would like to introduce our speakers today. You have met Biswajit already. He's the co-facilitator of this course. And if you haven't know, I repeat it again that he is a professor of economics at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade in New Delhi. He has long experience both from advising private, public, and international organizations. We're proud to have him as one of the ArtNet advisors to give consultations to us on research and training related to global value chains. And he also our advisory board member of ESCAP course on e-learning course on trade and SDGs. This is similar to Prabir. Prabir is our long colleague in ArtNet and also in the Trade SDG course. Prabir is professor at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, or RIS, in New Delhi. He's done many policy research for government of India, several national international organizations, including ESCAP, ADBI, IDE, and TIEP in Korea. We also have Dr. Nihal Pitikala. He is the senior economist. He has very long experience, more than 20 years, providing analytical and advisory work to promote sustainable trade and market-led development in Asia, Africa, and Middle East. Currently, he is engaged with the World Bank to develop strategy for regional integration for Africa countries. Okay, this was it. I will give the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vitada, and welcome back, everyone, and our experts today. We are really delighted to have them here. So participants, so you must have already completed all the modules, and there may be many questions. So you can write down the questions in the chat box. We have received few. We'll try to answer them. But before that, let me try to summarize the main learning, what we are expecting from these 4 modules. And then we'll request our 2 experts to give some opening remarks. And then we'll go into the question answer session, and the flow will go on. And we'll request our experts also to intervene in the question answer sessions as well. So we have roughly 1.5 hour time. And maybe we can divide the timing in such ways that let's first 15-20 minutes we basically focus on the introductory part, explanations, concepts, and the introductory remark, and rest of the time which will be devoted to the question answer. So all participants are requested to write your questions in the chat box, and we'll pick up the questions from there, and then we'll try to answer them. First of all, to summarize this program, this is an unique program because here we are trying to bring both academic, policymakers and researchers together. So in this unique platform, which actually even ESCAP and now supported by USAID has come up, so it gives us an idea that how the new age international trade is actually moving. Since 2000, I think Professor Richard Baldwin having a significant work in this. He says 21st century globalization, which is a completely different because of fragmentation of the production process. What is happening? It is no more necessary to produce every component in your own country. Second thing, because of digitization and integrations online, so a lot of services which are around the manufacturing process can also be outsourced. So this is an unique phenomenon. So initially it was been the literature is actually talked about global value chain, but later on we understood a much more deeper concept like production network, in which network itself becomes a value, whether you are in a profitable network, whether you are in a network to increase your productivity, whether you are in a network where actually you can do innovation, you can do upgrading. So all those things are actually coming back. So interestingly, global value chain literature is not only talking about just the trade, but it talks about innovation, it talks about skill, it talks about SME connection, it talks about trade facilitation, many other things. So the new dimension of global value chain is actually in the heart of the modern day trade. Now, what is happening? Many countries are participating, so we have a lot of evidences. Many countries are trying to participate, and many countries are still apprehensive. So this is basically the background. So on this background, actually, we are trying to understand the technical aspects, which is basically how you are actually trying to measure. So to measure the global value chain, we find a big challenge that the gross value of exports and imports are actually taking into account a lot of double counting. Why it is happening? Because of fragmented production systems, parts and components are moving from one country to the other country, and then some values are added, some new products have been made, new components, and it comes back, something like that. So we find that this double counting is increasing significantly. So technically, the challenge is how we can actually separate the double counting. So in the second module, actually, we used Cookman's model to understand that how actually we can separate. So to do that, we brought out several concepts. One of the concept is basically the foreign value added, so everyone can understand. Then domestic value added, and there is also basically what we call indirect value added. That value addition in your domestic production is going out and coming back as an import. So it becomes a part of foreign value added, need to be separated. So that's basically the source of the double counting. And then actually we highlighted that several organizations are actually coming up, developing this particular concept and creating databases and helping us to understand in which way the trade is actually happening. So the second module where actually we use the matrix algebra to explain that how actually DVA, FVA, and DVX can be calculated. In the third module, we took the example of Riva because that was basically an effort from UN's point of view. There are other databases also, like EORA is databases. There TIVA by OECD, there's a database. But Riva actually uses the database from ADB, which is basically a multi-regional input-output table. So in the second module, we also explain how does the multi-regional input-output table looks like, and how actually we can bring out the sources of the global value chain. So if you carefully look at the second module, you will see that we have an indirect ideas about the technological development of a country, because it's input and output. As you know, in economics, we understand technology as a function, which is basically connecting output and input. So we have input, We have output, so we have an idea indirectly that how efficient those inputs are. If more inputs are required to produce one output, that means it's not so efficient. Otherwise, if it is efficient. So if we are able to do it over the years, then actually input-output table can help us that whether there are technological improvement or not. And also input-output table can help us to understand the country's overall GDP because um, because summation of the overall gross value added in the country is basically GDP. So if you are able to calculate global values, then actually you'll be able to calculate the the GDP in an indirect way. One question possibly you must have noted or maybe missed out, how we are calculating value. What is value in a production process? So if you go to the second module, you will see that value of any production process is actually divided into three parts. Number one is basically the total wages paid to the employees, plus the profits the entrepreneurs are making, plus the taxes the production process is actually giving to the government. So these are basically the value. Rest are basically cost. Cost is basically the input cost. Suppose you require minerals, you require fuel, you require some machineries. Those are costs. Those are not values. So values is basically coming from wages, profits, and taxes. So any economy when the production process comes up, this is the way basically the value is generated. So we calculate the percentage of value in every production process and use this percentage to calculate that in my traded product, which is a component, how much is the value is actually going out of the country. So that's the way basically we do it in the second module, and the pictorials and the visuals are there in the third module. In the fourth module, which will be basically a major point of discussions today, that how trade policy can be made. As I said in the beginning, that the trade policy and the global value chain, this interaction is quite extensive in the sense that it's just not a trade, but there are many other things like technology, like innovations, like skills, like employment, like SME development, trade facilitation. So what we'll do, I'll stop here. We'll start from the module 4, that how actually the trade in value added can be linked to to improve the trade policy. And the last question is that we have seen a change in during the pandemic time, shortening of the supply chain, changes of supply chain, robust supply chain, keeping some redundancy. So we'd like to invite Nihal first to give his opening remark, and then we'll go to Praveer to understand that what is the ideas, and please kindly connect it to the BIMSTEC if possible. Over to you, Nihal.
Oh, thank you very much, Biswajit. Thank you for that introduction. What I would sort of emphasize through this course is this course actually comes at extremely relevant and opportune time, given that we are just emerging from the COVID-19. It's still reverberating, and there are implications of COVID still impacting how countries do their policies and how they plan in terms of policies and other interactions with the business sector in terms of sustaining livelihoods and generating value, if you like, in a circular fashion. But the relevance of GVC comes very much into focus because the current narrative of what's going on globally about the tensions that we see, both on the cost side, as Biswajit mentioned, coming out of the energy crisis and the food crisis, but also other tendencies, structural or systemic tendencies that is taking place globally that require BIMSTEC countries in particular, I'm assuming a lot of the participants are from BIMSTEC, is how to look at value chains, global value chains in general, and the regional value chains as part of it. We think both these are seamlessly connected. One needs to be efficient in order to survive in global value chains, but also those global value chains would have intricate linkages, either forward and backward within the region. So one interesting area that we want to sort of think about is what policies that might reinforce or enable further efficiencies of those existing value chains, and what policies or interactions that are needed to reinforce in order to move up in the process of product or tasks. These we use interchangeably. So I presume what I was trying to say is that you understood the basics of the value chains through this training course, and you also understand why GVC matters, and it's an important prerequisite for us to start this program. And in that sense, the link to productivity, the comparative advantage that you generate, the reasons of knowledge spillovers, the technology that you generate, wise firms that are hyper specialized tend to benefit more. What are the firm-to-firm relationship that enables them to do so? These background concepts are important as you learn the basics that you have done. Moving on to the policy areas, I think some of these fundamentals that it allows you to think other aspects of leading, how you generate these links, how do you sustain these links. And you may think not only in the goods but also services, but also the aspect of servicing, enabling the goods trade. You can think of Singapore basically as a great example that the services enabling the goods trade without a large production base or diversified production base, that it has been enabled to export the few that it exports, how much of the content of the services are enabling them to do that. So if you think of what drives them or what determines them, there are standards ways that economists usually look at it. The fact endowments, the standard story, the geography, the political stability are very important, aspects of the determining of linking and sustaining value chains. But that also depends on the context of what you are looking at. But if you were to look at, for example, the case study rather than in the input-output data, or then you would sort of emerge with the idea that through the case studies or through surveys, that the entrepreneurial ability, the skills and absorption capacity, et cetera. So that's a little bit of interesting policy aspect to look at. There are various ways to measure them. Gravity modeling, which my colleague here, Prabir, is very good at. I myself have done a few of these, are important ways, formal ways to look at it. But there are other means, qualitative means, one could get deeper into. Let me leave it at that and hand it over back to Biswajit. Thank you, Biswajit.
Yeah, thank you, Nihal, for a nice comment and organizing your thoughts in a way that, which is relevant for the developing economy, especially for the BIMSTEC region. Now I'll request Dr. Prabir De to come up and give his introductory remarks. One of the major issue in global value chain is basically the problems of trade facilitations and also the tariffs and non-tariffs barrier. Even there are small tariffs, if the components are crossing the border multiple times, so together actually with the small tariffs and every border, it becomes a huge cost. Secondly, if there are multiple countries involved in the trade facilitation process, if there are barriers and waiting time at every port, then actually the entire objective is actually lost. So many countries have developed some special economic zones or maybe a free zones around the major ports, and in their trade policy, they just try to highlight that these are the products actually which are very important for them to connect with the world. So, so Praveer, can you please give us some examples on that and articulate your argument about the possible development of global value chain in coming days? Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Jeet. Thank you, Uitada and Nihal. I'll be very brief, but I thought, since it is an interactive session and the participants will be more interested, please allow me to show 2 slides just for sake of conversation. Mr. Jeet, is okay? I can't hear you.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So I have how to, can you allow me, the organizers, to show my slides?
Probably requires the presenters, right?
Yeah. Okay. Good. No, I can't see. Anyway, I mean, it is not given to the right. So
on the right hand side at the top, you can see an up arrow. You are muted.
You are muted.
Prabir, can you please unmute yourself? I think we are not able to hear you, Prabir.
If you use earphone, just plug out and plug in again.
Yeah, this could be the reason. Oh.
Or if it's better to not use the earphone. We still cannot hear you, sorry.
Can you type in his chat box to boot, log out and log back in?
Yeah, Prabir, you may log out and log in once again. Okay. So meanwhile, let me just continue. Any specific aspects or example, Nihal, actually can remember about the trade facilitation issue? For example, even in Sri Lanka also, there may be a trade facilitation. Yeah.
Yeah. So in Sri Lanka case, we found out we have in our region countries who have. Let me go back very briefly to the border deterrence to value chains. So this is as you mentioned, there's a zooming effect. Prabir, are you back? Can we hear you?
No, we can't hear you.
Prabir, you have to, perhaps you have 2 screens. That might be one of the reasons. If you can take a minute to reboot your whole computer, that's one way to, I think you can get you back in.
I think he's out. Yeah.
So some of the old work I have done, this is countries with lower tariffs. That's when the political risks and communication cost and proximity becomes very important. But if you were to look at individual countries in our region, for example, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka has prohibitive level of tariff, not only custom duties, but para tariffs. That has basically decimated the impact that on value chains, basically how they have insulated is by the special economic zones. Now, if you take that special economic zones, it will leave out SMEs to a large extent, that it will become at an exception, as we have discussed before. The trade facilitation is a little spoken, but a very important part of this entire linkage, because you're basically boils down to transaction cost, right? So each of the additives, the value chain is as efficient as the weakest link in the chain. So if you have one of the members whose tariffs or the trade facilitation environment, including logistics related costs, then you're likely to see inefficiencies at the entire value chain, and that value chain may not survive for long. That's where the SMEs generally tend to struggle, because they usually in that sort of a transaction, because the transaction cost as a unit of output is high for SMEs, where large firms can, have scale large enough to survive. The SMEs tend to be out of that process. So certainly, I mean, there's a lot of empirical work done on the logistics side of things, but I think we are still looking at the surface when it comes to the BIMSTEC region. And this is why I think in the BIMSTEC region, this is entirely unexplored. Especially in ASEAN, they have done a large deal of work with regard to the structural issues as well as the trade facilitation issues, especially the infrastructure connectivity, the logistic cost, the transportation, communication cost, but not so much within the BIMSTEC context. And I would also add that very little in the South Asian context as well. So this is extremely important for our audience to understand. Perhaps at some stage they would take a little more interest in them, and that becomes part of the policy discussion as well. Back to you, Biswajit.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So there are two more issues actually which are becoming very sort of debatable. One is what is the role of FTA and what is the role of investment. So I have come across some suggestions like India-Bangladesh border or India-Myanmar border. So near the border, if both sides actually invest, so people do not need to cross the border, but the components can actually cross the border. So both the countries, there are a lot of land mass, which is land borders are there. So actually, if you are able to do, for example, in Myanmar, the food processing can be done in both sides. Actually, what happened in Mizoram, yeah, I think it was some disturbances. Anyway, so in case of Nepal, also Nepal with Bihar in their border, so there could be possibilities of some investment. It could be some machineries, it could be plastic products, it could be utensils. So to start with, I'm not going into the big ones which are highlighted, like textiles, like automobiles, like electronics. So in South Asia, that can be done, and it doesn't require a big investment, actually. So that's basically one idea. But over to you, Nihal, one second, regarding the trend of investment in the GVCs and how FTAs are actually taking the advantage of that. Are there examples in other parts of the world, which actually in BIMSTEC we can get certain ideas?
Yeah, I think they have very good examples coming out of Africa, because now they are thinking of GVC in African context rather than in disparate regional contexts like the EAC or Southern African SACU or the West Africa region. Now they have realized that these extended links beyond the two-country models are becoming paramount to think of the efficiency of the GVCs. And you can think of that Africa has enough diversity. So one of the important things, Biswajit, I don't want this to be a conversation between you and I, but I think it comes out interesting questions. one of the standard ways you can look at the GVCs is if the region is sufficiently diversified, that the countries could specialize, that there is one school of thought, it needs to have sufficient diversification of, in structures for vertical fragmentation, vertical linkages to take place. But on the other hand, similar countries, if you take the European example, have traded in similar types of good, the horizontal linkage that led to Paul Krugman to write his famous article. So do we need to be at advanced level for that sort of horizontal trade to take place? The intermediate goods moving across India to Thailand, back to India, from India to Sri Lanka, or are we only thinking in terms of the vertical sort of structures? So that's important. In terms of FTA, Biswajit, I think this is absolutely important. One of the reasons that we have this roundtable is precisely because of that, because we think that the current transaction environment within South Asia itself is completely, how would you say, is nuanced or filled with frictions that is not optimal. So BIMSTEC is a one way to look at it. With the extension of Thailand, you bring that additional aspect of both the market as as well as the diversification of the sector. So when you think of that, then I think fundamentally I agree with you, although some of the econometrics may not suggest tariff is important, because the agents are usually react to incentives, and one of the main incentives that they're looking at into what's going on at the border. So as you mentioned, it could be tariff, it could be other impediments at the border, that the border is simply not developed enough for the transaction to make a transaction smooth. So sorry for the convoluted response.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is just a warm-up discussion because I was trying to encourage the participants to write down their questions on the chat box. So if you want to speak with us, kindly raise your hand and actually ask the questions directly. So I have received one question here I can see. Do you think geopolitics will derail GVC to something more fragmented? What do you recommend for BIMSTEC countries in this basically the dynamic aspect? So now geopolitics is basically started from US-China trade war, and this might be having another impact. And maybe in the post-pandemic situation, people are more scared, trying to have a second line of defense if one of the supply chain gets some kind of problems, then what we are going to, so in which directions we are going, and what is the learning for BIMSTEC from this particular experience. In one way, BIMSTEC is not well connected, that Nihal has already been mentioned, and there are a lot of, in case of South Asia, our intra-South Asia trade is still suboptimal, significantly suboptimal. So so can you pick up, Nihal, any product or any sector to give your answer that there are changes in supply chain, and maybe South Asia or maybe BIMSTEC region as a whole can take the advantage of it? Maybe Thailand and India are ahead, but what about the other countries? How they are going to take the advantage? Any studies or any experience in World Bank or USAID studies?
So the geopolitics question is a very tricky one. It's already, I think, starting to make changes to existing value chains to some extent. We are yet a very recent formal analysis of what that entails in terms of, reconfiguring the existing value chain. But I would say BIMSTEC should be an insurance policy to start with. This is why the BIMSTEC is so important. And I would say that in that vein, India's role is actually central to it. If you go back to the advent of value chains, way back in the 80s and 90s, one of the fundamental reasons that gave rise to value chains is the multinational enterprises saw as individual agents a profit-making opportunity, and they decided that they can transact over some of their functions, not only internally, not only in inter-country, but globally, right? And what's the reason? Because US is already an open economy, and that was the conduit or the reasons for value chains to propagate, right? And then it evolved into Europe being part of it, Japan being part of it, and China becoming the center of gravity in the value chain. So now with the tensions geopolitically unhealthy in terms of the overall global output, the global efficiencies, because then you are worried about you're picking maybe suboptimal choices. So they're also concerned about that. But in any case, for regions like BIMSTEC, actually, it's a good time to start thinking in terms of strategic aspects of the value chains. Value chains is, I would say, generally in trade, but I think value chains is a good way to get an insight and seek answers to that. How would, because when you say value chains, still the backward linkage might still be beyond the region. The forward linkage might be beyond the BIMSTEC region. So these are beyond the control of the BIMSTEC countries. So then the important thing is to talk about how to improve efficiencies in order to survive if there is frictions taking place beyond the region. Then one could think about, Biswajit, this is thinking far ahead, as India started to grow, become more diversified, especially. And then when Thailand started to grow and diversify, when Bangladesh started to grow and diversify, it creates a lot more opportunities for BIMSTEC region to evolve its own set of value chains at a very surface level. So I think this is an important empirical question for us as well, BIMSTEC. Back to you.
So this means that we require a lot of in-depth studies.
Yeah.
And there are three ways actually the studies are done. For the benefit of the participants, I'd like to highlight the three ways the global value chain studies are done. Number one is through the case studies. Okay, we pick up a sector and follow the production process, calculating every time what is the value addition, and identify what are the main barriers, whether it is in the border or behind the border, how the ease of doing business is going up. Second thing, we try to understand it through the kind of models what we have learned here. So which is basically using the input-output model. And the third model is basically clearly looking into just the trade data. So we identify a sector, and within the sector, we identify which are the components and which are the intermediate goods and which are the final goods. And then we say that how much the country is importing the components, how much the country is exporting the components. So we look into intra-industry trade to understand that, how the global value chain is actually working. So what I have realized from Nihal's, views that BIMSTEC is a region which has not been explored properly. There could be a lot of possibilities and hidden things, which I think is the time for us right now to look into these things and move ahead. Okay, so let me just go into some other questions. We have received one set of clarificatory notes. So let me just go into that. And I will share the note here. So I hope this is visible.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
is.
So this is a Word file which one of the participants has sent. So there are several concepts he or she has tried to summarize. That's very good, actually. So so some concepts are here. I will pick up few of them. For example, these are the definitions. You can just quickly read. When we say supply chain and value chain, so this is the most important thing, the difference between supply chain and value chain. Supply chain is basically only the productions and logistics, okay? And value chain starts before the production. That means basically R&D, product planning and kind of things. And value chain continues after the production process. That means after the product is delivered to the final customer, you may be a customer loyalty, maybe branding, you may be marketing. So what we have seen in our course, there is something called smile curve. So in smile curve, the production activity is in the lower part of the smile curve, and the two ends where actually the values are very high. So which is basically not production activities. So so what happens actually, multinationals basically try to control the both ends, but they can outsource the production process from other countries where actually low value is generated. So it is expected that and the initial process of the value chain, and the countries will not be able to generate that much of value. But most important thing is basically to remain in the network. Once you remain in the network, then there is a possibility that you will able to do a little bit of innovation. So that's basically the main idea here, that you will be able to upgrade your product, you'll be able to innovate, you will be able to find out a new buyers, a whole lot of things actually you can do it. We have seen these things in India's textile industry, in leather industry. So a lot of things are being procured from here, and similarly from Bangladesh, from other countries as well. But some companies out there are gaining the knowledge, and they're trying to diversify. So global value chain is actually making the trade more knowledge intensive. So in other way you can see. So so there are three major concepts: domestic value added, foreign value added, and indirect value added. I'll go back to the PowerPoint and explain this stuff. So this is one aspect. And then we discussed about Riva. So Riva, I think, doesn't require much discussion because it's so good in visualization that, you'll be able to explain it with the note, the backward and forward linkages. And FTI, this I think requires a discussion, further discussion, that how much investment is coming, along with the technology, how much investment is coming just to basically capture the efficient production process or something like that. And trade facilitation we have discussed. What we have not discussed much about the financing. So Nihal, I'll get back to you on financing part. And then we have maybe any questions on Riva. So what I do, I go back to the PowerPoint presentations once again. I think Pravir is back.
Yes.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
Pravir, I mean, your part was discontinued, so can you please just explain that how trade facilitation can actually help
Yeah.
global solution?
Can you
Participants,
hear?
I'll come back to the PowerPoint presentations after
Can you hear
this.
me
Yeah,
this time?
absolutely fine.
Some technical issue. Let me quickly share my slide. This is the problem. If they don't assign me, the right to show my PowerPoint, I can't help actually.
Yeah, so Pravir requires a
Now
presentation.
they have shared it. Yes.
Okay.
Right. What I'm going to following what Biswajit said in on last time in November, and today's conversation, both Biswajit and Nihal. I want to focus more on the logistics and trade facilitation. Recently, in another forum, we have been discussing what could be the enabling factors and what could be the enabling conditions and their respective intensities in forming the GVCs. This is just a kind of an illustration, not a country specific or anything else like that. But if you see the, both very, very important, high, both in terms of factors and intensity, the high end is required as a market, technology, trade policy, investment policy, physical and digital connectivity. Logistics is equally important, but when we are, when we talk about the physical and digital, we need to separate it out because the policies for logistics is slightly different while dealing with the physical and digital infrastructure. Now, if you come to the quadrant in the to almost which are very much obstructions, which are very much not which are not supporting the formation of GVCs, both conditions and factors are economic and political sanction, governance, and political unrest, which Biswajit and Nihal will be talking about more. Now, if I may, coming a little more about the logistics supports, warehousing, physical and digital connectivity, and if I show you some example, in case of Bay of Bengal, just a minute, like in the Bay of Bengal, if you look at its geographical position and how the GVC formations, which are its location plus its linkages, particularly in the maritime front, which could be the enabling factors, enabling conditions for forming the GVCs. If you look at the port facilities, its linkages, and there are many other things, the SEZs, distribution centers, etc., etc. And Bay of Bengal, or is a formal arrangement called BIMSTEC. They are fortunate compared to others in terms of its maritime, the linkages, because the ports in the east coast or ports in other Myanmar, Bangladesh, or Thailand west coast, they are very near to each other, but yet not yet connected. So Bay of Bengal countries, they are trying to bring them closer in terms of through some agreement called Maritime Cooperation Agreement. What the agreement might be, I'm digressing a little more. Agreement is basically to support movement of cargo and passengers from one of these ports, which is a garland from Colombo all the way to Renong, without much hassles, without much trouble, and acknowledge, reciprocal acknowledgement for movement of vessels, passengers, and goods from one port to another, without discrimination in terms of its movement. Discrimination, why? Because foreign flag holders, foreign flag bearers of vessels picking up a container from port in Thailand for a delivery to Colombo, it cannot touch other ports, because of domestic restrictions. But Bay of Bengal countries, looking at the logistical requirement, warehousing for garments export to Bangladesh, which is almost full, they would like to utilize the space, SEZ's coastal economic zone in the Bay of Bengal region, particularly in the east coast, starting from Haldia all the way to Tuticorin and Kochi. So also, Indian ports are approaching to the Myanmar or Thailand, Sri Lanka to use each other, on very reciprocal and acknowledged, basis. So these are the understanding. If it is done, then certainly on logistic front, trade facilitation front, Bay of Bengal countries or BIMSTEC member countries, according to me, will have much, scope to strengthen their regional value chain linkages. Garments export, for example, Bangladesh, or pharmaceuticals export for Bangladesh, which are demanded globally. they cannot do it much because they don't have adequate space and specialized space available near to their deep sea port or a river port. They need to be stored as well as to be exported globally through the links it has, and that's why they need an access. Let me then go to some of the examples of the value chains of Biswajit and Nihal said and Uitada, that how do you identify there's the value chains are coming up with the help of trade facilitation. So I have some real life examples like this the Toyota car which is assembled in Bengaluru, parts and components, they all came from Southeast Asia. There are a couple of enabling factors. One is a free trade agreement. Second is rules of origin, etc., which Biswajit will be already discussed. They are very much in the module. Those actually helped the Toyota to assemble and design a car for mass India and also to the export. Similarly, if you come to the Dell computer assembly plant in Chennai or a drug, they're all being part of the GVC, or you can call a regional value chain. Similarly, this computer, the tab by Samsung, then telephone equipment by National Panasonic, and the current iPhone 13 and 14, which they have also some, in components coming from Southeast Asia. They've used why they are finding it advantageous to moving into the India because of market. Second is India could improve its trade facilitation performance. And third is there is a free trade agreement between India and South. Certainly, those will be discussed. There are other examples which have been promoted, which have grown up because of domestic and the broader facilitation, like the pharmaceuticals in northeast part of India, the food process items like the drinks, etc., with Bhutan. So these are the Bay of Bengal countries, pharmaceutical, processed foods, horticulture. Even though they are in the low level of value chains, they're very much guided and supported with the trade facilitations. These are some of the examples which I can show, which supported and by very much by improvement in the trade facilitation, both at the border, which are physical type, and also the which are soft infrastructure, like countries joining into regional free trade agreement or paperless trade arrangements, or acknowledging each other's several other standards. So those are some of the soft infrastructure which have also facilitated the value chain formations, centering in the Bay of Bengal countries. I stop here. Thank you very much. Over to you, Biswajit.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Pravi. You can stop sharing your PowerPoint. Yeah, let me just check whether there are any questions. No questions actually. You can raise your hand if anyone wants to speak. Right. Right. Okay, so let me just go back to the technical chapter, which is basically module 2. And let me try to articulate actually how this is important.
Okay, you have one question in the chat.
Okay, so what is the question? Let me just go back. Yeah, there is one question. How do public policies can promote functional upgrading, expanding downstreams in a GVC where governance is ruled by few buyers and transforming companies? Yeah, that's a very good question actually. I can give example from Japan's point of view. In Japan's industrialization is the process is different from many other countries. It has a process called fragmentations and agglomeration. and internationalization. There are three processes. So whenever any innovations is happening by the big companies, then government will fund the innovation if the big companies are ready to fragment the production. So suppose any production process is having 10 or 20 subsections or components or kind of things, then government will basically promote agglomerations. So in the agglomeration process, what happens? Actually, government decides about the land where actually government will invite the SMEs to come and set up with certain incentives. So when the smaller players are coming together in a particular kind of a industrial zones with some incentives, and their main target is to supply initially the one OEMs, and then generally the competition starts among the small players. When the competition starts, then there is a possibility of functional upgrading. So they might link it to a further downstream. What may happen in the process that that government can actually invite the other companies to set up another zone. So this is the way basically the public policies can actually promote functional upgrading. So government role will be here basically providing incentives in the form of infrastructure, one. Number two, maybe discounts in importing capital goods. Number three, there may be some kind of a trade facilitation related incentives, like in logistics subsidies and some kind of subsidies can be done. So these are the way actually the government can actually can move the smaller players to basically to move forward. Yes. One more hand I can see. Any other question, Vitada? Have I missed?
You may call Lakshman to speak.
Yes, Lakshman. Yeah, go ahead with your question. Lakshman, can you hear me? No. So let me just go back to my PPT. Is it visible?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Yeah. So what I said in very brief in 2-3 slides, actually, I can say. So if you look at this input output table on the right hand side one, so you can see that the values are basically the wages, the profit and the taxes. So this is the one which I wanted to say that, you know, when you think of value chain, first question is what is value? So value is basically this. The rest of them are cost, which is there in the ash color matrix, which are basically the cost of production. But these are the values. So how much is government is getting out of it? How much the profit is being generated? How much wages are being paid? So this is the standard practice in this literature. Okay, so using this, actually, you can have a value-added matrix. For example, this is an MRIO example. So you can see that VA matrix, which is the red color box. So you can see it's a diagonal matrix, but for every country, it is basically a row matrix. For country one, it is 1172, 1120, 1676, and 1648. For country 2 is the second row, for country 3 is the third row, but you have a VA matrix. So what we do in calculation of values when it is being exported or being imported, we try to understand in the production process what is the value added percentage. So here what we see in the VA matrix for production of sector 1 in country 1, the total value generated is 1172. So what is the small v, which is basically the value added percentage, is basically 1172 by 6901, right? So let's just check what is the value. It comes as 1172 divided by 6901. So it is close to 17%. So we'll carry this 17% in the trade. Suppose this country one is exporting some amount of a good one to country two. For example, country one is exporting, say, 8119 to country two, as you can say, as intermediate goods. This 819, when it is being exported, 17% of this is actually the domestic value addition. This is the way actually we move forward. So I think this is the easiest way to explain the stuff. So through the process, what we do, after the calculations, you can see that the gross export is divided into two parts. One is the domestic value added and foreign value added. And the domestic value added part is actually is having several components. One is when you are exporting the final goods. Remember, exporting final good is not part of the global value chain because it's a value chain. So it has to go to the as an intermediate goods. Then exported in intermediate goods and then exported in intermediate goods, which is re-exported to third countries. Okay, so this can be absorbed by the direct importers. So they make, for example, Pravir has given the example of Toyota car in Bangalore. So Toyota car factory in Bangalore actually produces the gearbox. This is the global production center for producing gearbox. So in Thailand, when the Toyota is being made, so it is importing gearbox from India. But those cars, some of them will be sold in Thailand and some of them will be exported. Okay. So when we consider the total value in the global value chain, so India's gearbox fitted into a Toyota car in Thailand, which is exported to, say, Malaysia. Okay, so then actually this becomes this value of gearbox as a percentage of the total value of the product. We'll add it in every stages so that we can understand what will be India's component, even Thailand's exports to Malaysia. Okay, so this is the way basically we do it. And this is a much bigger explanations that or other structure. So here actually we have value-added exports, domestic content in intermediate exports, and final goods which come back home, and the foreign content. So all the programming at the back right now, even Stata is also having a program to calculate the double counting and calculate the foreign value added and domestic value added. So one study, which is in 2013, is found out that almost 27.3% was actually the double counting in 17 major ESCAP countries. Okay, so you can understand that the gross exports are saying that around 4.2 trillion trade, but once we do in a value-added trade, then we find out that actually the value-added trade is 3 trillion only. So rest of them things are basically intra-industry, intra-country trade and going from one to the other part. Because of this high overestimation of gross exports, what we have seen in the world is actually the total value of exports may be crossing the total value of GDP, because GDP is only taking into account the value-added part, right? But the goods are being exported, re-exported, and further added value and then exported into third country. So if you just sum the gross exports, then it would have been a much higher than the world GDP. So few definitions what we have looked into is basically apart from foreign value added, domestic value added. These are the two major indicators actually we use. One is GVC position, another is GVC participation. So what is the difference between position and participation, and why we are using this particular index, a set of indices? So participation is very is important. What is basically the foreign value added and the indirect value added. Okay, so that's basically the overall participation, and position is basically we try to understand the backward and the forward. You can see that the DVX is basically the backward and the forward is basically how much you are good. So more of the DVX and less of FVA will actually help us to understand whether the position is changing. So what we have done here is basically an understanding about the Southeast Asia. So for every country, we put some color. So for example, in case of China, if you look at the red color, so in case of China, actually what happened, GVC participation increased between 2000 and 2010 significantly. Okay, but after that, participation has slightly come down, but position has increased, improved. So position improved means actually China is moving from the last stage of the value chain towards the backward. So more backward means more value can be generated, because just take the example of iPhone. I think it's very much common and available in the internet. The China's contribution is around just 5%, because China is in the value chain of iPhone is just at the last stage. So it is doing the activity like assembling and finalizing, packaging and selling. Once you are at the last stage of participation, then actually what happens, your value generated from that will be very low. But if you over the time, if you're doing a little bit of innovations, you are trying to go back, that means you are actually making more components. And once you're making more components, that may be having higher values. For example, I visited phone making companies here in outside of Delhi, and I found that most of the machines in making phones, and like how to embed the IC chip, how to handle the battery, how to introduce some software. So all the machines are actually in that factory. Of course, I have seen those are Japanese machines. Now remember, Japan is not making a big way in the phone today. So Japan is actually controlling the production process. So Japan is controlling production process means Japan is having more value. So even if a Chinese phone which is coming into an Indian market or maybe an other market, maybe they are produced from some basic components which are produced in China, but machines could be still from other countries. So those countries are actually in a higher position of the global value chain. So this is the way we need to look into the positions and participation, which can actually help us to understand the dynamics of global value chain. We can do this exercise for BIMSTEC as well. And to identify the product, we need Nihal's help as well as even ESCAP's help to identify the products and how actually we can move it forward. So I have two questions left, Nihal and Praveer. One of them is basically about investment and skill development, so that upgrading can be done. So over to you, Nihal and Praveer, one by one, maybe.
Okay, I think a quick thought on Sujit, you mentioned about the what is the appropriate government role in propagating value chains or facilitating the sustainable value chains. The empiricism is very much on interventions on market-based instruments, so that doesn't not distort. I sound like a World Bank economist. I apologize for that. But one of the reasons for that is that's for developing countries, the best way to look at it is look at how the private sector has managed some R&D themselves. The examples from Malaysia, Singapore, of course, US provides the best example. Most of the innovation has taken place through the private sector initiatives. It may have come from a garage back in San Francisco in some corner. Then it evolved into a much more wide network that has transformed into agglomeration. that sort of a facility, the environment that provides that sort of a thing is basically comes from an entrepreneurial culture. So that entrepreneurial culture is developed very much in the East Asian examples that one could see. Um, the So what I'm basically principally trying to say is to address something back you said is to be cautious in sort of a understanding what would the government role be, because I think then we are getting into a very large area of uncertainty, how best to utilize uh, at a time when the governments in this region are facing debt crisis, particularly the domestic debt, and it's still trying to help out firms that have been affected by the COVID. This dilemma between using the precious resources without having sunset clauses, without having prior initial entrepreneurial initiative, and then done some background work and come back to the government is probably the way. But generally, I would say just to do
Sorry.
I think we have,
cutting,
yeah. So
cutting
your voice is breaking actually, Nihal. Yeah, go ahead.
Um, cutting red tape. The what was your other question, Biswajit? The last one.
Other question is about investment because and skill development.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the areas I forgot to mention in that matrix is that one of the successes that we identify from the East Asian example is basically having vocational institute, developing appropriate skills, still is an empirical question. How do you do it? Where do you assign your resources to do it? Then again, the examples are showing the private sector take the initiative and the government supporting it would be the best. And your Japan example is an excellent one, but it would be, I would say that you will find results closer to the income category of India, Thailand, and Sri Lanka to the extent coming from Singapore, maybe to some extent Korea and Taiwan. Over to you.
Okay, Praveer.
Well, Mr. Ajit, on the financing, I think my take is there are two possible policy interventions at the country level before before you promote any value chain or regional value chain. The governments of a participating regional blocks, for example, Bay of Bengal region is BIMSTEC, they have a very strong role, in promoting the value chains, both for the regions and the globally. At the moment, there is no such kind of arrangements or initiative, but the government has a role. And which way? First, I think the export banks, exim banks for respective countries, they need to do, more understanding each other uh, through networks, through their assistance. This is the government. Exim banks are primarily the government driven. So 7 countries in the Bay of Bengal, for example, if their exim banks support each other by swapping currencies if needed, or through different other arrangements, that could give kind of a feel good for the firms, the companies. These are very much important. I have seen it in ASEAN context between ASEAN and China. Chinese Exim Bank and ASEAN Exim Banks, they are very much well connected in that way to support trade, as well as that goes into building the value chain. Second point, like the mutual recognition between the member participating countries. So on which government has a very strong role, coming up with a mutual recognition agreement on the products or services. So those, if done, that could, help promote a value chain in the region. So government at the macro level, governments on a financing part, this is some examples. Like export credit guarantee organizations. If a product produced, in the final assembly, if I'm going to the regional, a particular region, so if those export credit guarantee participating countries, their respective export credit guarantees companies, if they support, then SMEs or MSMEs, they feel encouraged to be part of the chain, the value chain. So government's policy equally very important. And when it comes to the farm level, I think here on the financing part, which I would like to highlight about the payment systems. One, the traditional way, it is just like opening of line of letter of credit in the bank, LC accounts, etc., etc. And we know it very well. This is a very much traditional. There are many disputes, etc. But if you look at particular value chain between China or India or China or Southeast Asia, payment systems between the buyers and the sellers are different than normally which are being practiced in elsewhere, because the sellers, they demand completely advance payment, 90% of advance payment, then they will move the goods in the cross border. Whereas that letter of credit to the banks, procedures is completely different. So here the banking arrangements, relation between the banks, those are very important. It varies country wise, but what I see in the 10 Southeast Asian countries they have done is basically to connecting particular banks, their national banks, their respective coordinating banks, to support the trade, and as well as those actually feed into the value chain process. The last but not the least, the payment systems. If you look at for a small and a small amount of payment, or if you compare it to the larger payment, then the payment mechanisms, if gets changed. If you look at it, a small payment, for example, payment through the digital applications, we call it in India called UPI. Many of the small startups in Southeast Asia, between Malaysia and Singapore, they, due to their interoperability and acknowledgement between countries, they pay through their startups, pay through their apps, and similarly, between several parts of within the India. Largely, the digital payment systems are not yet universal, even not even in a regional. Given the technological advantage that is Bay of Bengal countries they are having, and with Southeast Asia, I think this is a scope to enhance the payment system much faster, better, transparent way, and that is the digital payment systems. Here is government, and both at the farm level they have a very strong role, in acknowledging the payment systems and making the rules more transparent and helpful. I think these are there are to sum up on the payment. One is the government has a very strong role, which is primarily as a regulator, as a facilitator. Second is which comes to the farm level, where the payment systems between the companies, between the exporters, importers, buyers, sellers. So those are very important. Thank you.
Yes, yeah. Thank you very much, Praveer, to bring up such an important issue. So services, especially financial services, play a very important role in integrating the countries and the companies. But who will be the responsible company or the government who will be investing, because this requires a bit of investments. So so do you suggest that BIMSTEC countries may come together and develop payment systems to facilitate the exporters and traders, or the BIMSTEC countries may invite international companies to develop a systems here? So what is your suggestion in this case?
Yeah, so far I have not come across any regional payment system, not yet, across the world. But I've seen between countries, like with Singapore, with a couple of them. Singapore has been signing digital and technological cooperation agreement with many countries, the bilateral basis, and that's including acknowledgement of their payments, including the arrangements between the central banks, etc. But from a regional context, we haven't seen it much progress. But this would be a good way to start in the Bay of Bengal, because when you talk about, Sujit, in your presentations, when you talk about regional value chain, both in Bay of Bengal and the global value chain that's coming out from some of the Bay of Bengal countries, payment system makes lots of the lots of implication, particularly for SMEs and MSMEs who are hooked into the production chains. Here, Bay of Bengal countries, the central banks, they can do more, just acknowledging the payment systems, making a regional payment systems, particularly to check the defaults, other things. Government, Central Bank of India and Central Bank of Singapore, they have signed such agreement. But I have seen recently, even though central banks have signed, but acknowledgement of payment through UPIs doesn't work between Singapore and India. While you move under mode 4 in services and go to Singapore and buy something from there, from India, the payment doesn't acknowledge the payment gateway. So there are a lot of things can be done, and it would be a good way to start a regional payment system for BIMSTEC.
Right. It's a very good suggestion. I think some of the policymakers, if they are there in the audience, they can note it. So one last area, after that I'll get back to Vidada, is about the skill development, because this requires a lot of skill to participate in global value chain. So both Prabir and Nihal, if you can just elaborate a little bit on your idea about whether there are any programs going on, or whether the government can adopt some new ideas of skill development to the global value chain. You can start with Nihal.
I actually do not know any particular example that currently exists, but there is a lot of chatter or discussion about the need to have vocational training programs, skill development programs, how to link the university, the academia, especially technical faculties into the policy making, actually the process of incentivizing industries. So that discussion is still evolving, and this is an area ripe for analysis, further investigation, learning from examples of the countries, and maybe adapting given the current circumstance. But because in a large scheme of things, currently the preoccupation is towards facilitating the maybe finances, for example, easing competitions and things like that. The skill development, those things are, I think, a medium-term and long-term programs, long-term efforts. So that require a little bit of, due diligence before you start it. Once again, the moral hazard of self-selecting is also an issue in this context. So one have to think about it. So once again, I would say the starting point still would be the entrepreneurial culture, look into what sectors that may be emerging and whether we can augment it. IT sector may be a good example, Biswajit, to start with. Going in IT sector in Bhutan, even as small as it is, what is going on in Sri Lanka in the IT sector. There's a lot of cross compatibility or complementarities in the IT sector that can sort of trigger this kind of thing, and the government basically can follow that and see where that is getting done. The problem is our bureaucracies are not very sophisticated. That's what primarily the difference between the South Asia, as I see. I would make Thailand an exception to that versus the rest of East Asia. Let me hand back to Prabir.
So we have just 5 minutes left. So Prabir, any quick idea about the skill development and GBC connection?
Yes, equally, very important. I can see that skill development, particularly the regions or areas falling behind in the region, like northeastern part of India, and if you travel there, or the products or services which are clustered in the border areas. You can see that skill is, basically the skill for the locals who as a part of the livelihood in the value chains is not there inadequate. So the trade and exchange of goods across borders are done very, very rudimentary way because we could not train with an appropriate skill for the local people to do the trade and part of the exchange process, both in goods and services. So I think skilling has equally very high importance, and for which government, particularly the subnational units, they can do a better role here. Thank you.
Good. Even I've seen in India also, actually, some e-commerce companies are training the SMEs how to operate on the digital platform, because that's very important with small players that, they get their procurement, orders, payments, everything can be done in. So that's basically IT training is the first important thing, the digitalization of the business. So that possibly the starting point. Anyway, we have only a few minutes left. I can leave it to now Vitada to summarize and to find out any specific requirement still unanswered. Vitada.
Thank you very much, ESCAP. Sorry. Thank you very much, Biswasit, Prabir, and Nihal for the extensive discussion. Although we don't have much questions from participants now, I think they will digest the materials. Many of them I see still ongoing with doing quiz and learning modules. So along the way, they will have more questions, and they probably put in the chat in the class, which we will follow up and let you know. And I would like to reiterate that the importance of evidence this course try to highlight is to build the understand on CVCs and on how countries, both in BIMSTEC and outside BIMSTEC, are connected in this dynamic. Although many factors, many shocks are facing global value chains, but so far, both the crisis, the health, the current food crisis, and so on, we still see that CVC is still be the core underpinning of trade flows, and it will still continue to be, although some alternate production locations happens, but the content and the principles that we learn in this course will stay. With that, I also would like to remind participants that you will deserve to get certificate from the course, but the condition is you have to finish the quiz of all modules and pass it at 65% achievement rate. So please go back during the learning and taking quiz, and also please fill in evaluation form that Natapon has put in the chat, so we will know how we could offer in a better way, or what would you like to see more in this kind of course and in other course of ESCAP that we will collaborate with partners such as you said in this event. With that, I thank all participants who stay throughout these 2 hours, and also doing hard work in going through all the technical modules that we give to you. Thank all the speakers today, and thanks Biswasit in particular for being with me throughout this course for several versions already. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank ESCAP and USAID also for organizing this program. I hope the participants are benefited, and thanks to Vitada, Nihal, and Prabir, because without this this lively discussion would not have happened. Okay, thank you very much. So we can
Thank
now.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.